Superheroes from the 90s were, they were recognizable, I'll give them that. Honestly, I'd be willing to bet that if I asked you to imagine a 90s superhero, even those of you who have never picked up a comic book in your life would imagine something pretty similar and unfortunately accurate. Don't get me wrong, there was a lot of good stuff coming out during that time, but for every good comic, we had 5 cookie-cutter, muscle-bound, gun-toting alpha male types, and for every 10 of those, we would get a character who was truly unique. In 1991, right at the beginning of this weird decade, Marvel delivered us an absolute hidden gem, one that I feel I have a sort of holy obligation to inform as many people about as possible. I am talking about the nemesis of nightmares, the defender of the dreamscape, the character who, in my opinion, is the most underrated Marvel hero of all time, Sleepwalker. Oh, you haven't heard of him? Well, buckle up, cause you are gonna hear today. First off, who and or what is this odd green man? Well, he is a sleepwalker. Yes, Sleepwalker is technically a title and not this character's name per se. His real name is not exactly pronounceable by human mouths, but since he's the only sleepwalker that frequently operates on the material plane, he just goes by the name Sleepwalker to make it easier on everyone, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So who are the Sleepwalkers as an organization? They are a group of beings that patrol the mindscape, frequently referred to as dream police, but don't worry, they aren't reading anyone's minds or arresting people for thought crimes. In fact, quite the opposite. They might be called police, but monster hunter is probably a better term. Remember, this is the Marvel Universe, where any number of psychic abominations are trying to break their way into Earth at any given time, and it's the job of the Sleepwalkers to prevent that. One such creature, referred to as Cobweb, is where the story of our Sleepwalker begins. Now, we don't actually have that much information on Cobweb's backstory, which is insane considering how powerful he's stated to be. The one page of background that we have on Cobweb states that he has stalked the mindscape since before recorded time, twisting people into madness and apparently doing it very well. Quote, "So cunning is his craft that those who fall to him take comfort in his presence even as Cobweb destroys them." So yeah, we're dealing with a master gaslighter nightmare demon here. As you can probably guess, the Sleepwalkers have been hunting Cobweb for quite a long time, but have never been able to pin him down. Thanks to their long history though, he knows their tricks and he knows their rules. The Sleepwalkers, very importantly, are not allowed to enter mortal minds. They operate in the mindscape, yes, but at the sort of upper level where it's a collective psychic plane. They patrol this region, keeping an eye out for any monsters trying to enter specific minds and stop them before that can happen. If they fail though, and a psychic entity does cross that barrier, they cannot follow them, because this can actually make things worse. Not only is it a massive breach of privacy, it's also incredibly dangerous for everyone involved. As Sleepwalker himself puts it, any foreign entity, even one noble of purpose, can cause irreparable damage to that mind. And, you know, there's other reasons why they're not allowed to do it too, but we'll get to those in a second. It's a very important rule, we'll leave it at that. But regardless, Sleepwalker chooses to ignore it this time. After all, he has Cobweb on the ropes, and Cobweb is a big enough threat that he's worth taking a risk for, right? Yeah, wrong. During Sleepwalker's fight with Cobweb, the villain enters a human mind and Sleepwalker follows. But this was Cobweb's plan, because now he's essentially on his home territory. Sleepwalkers are not great at navigating individual human minds because they can vary so greatly, but Cobweb has been invading them for thousands of years. He's got experience, and he gets Sleepwalker stranded in there. All hope is not lost though, there's protocol for this, and though it might take some time, Sleepwalker can get himself back to the mindscape by navigating out using a device called an Imaginator. But a question remains in all this, whose brain is he in? I've mentioned a human mind a couple times, what human are we talking about exactly? That would be Rick Sheridan. Rick is not a superhero, he's not even affiliated with superheroes, he's just a college student in New York City and a totally regular guy. That is, until he starts getting plagued by nightmares of this weird green man. Now, of course, these nightmares are not intentional. Sleepwalker's not trying to hurt Rick, this is just a side effect as Sleepwalker tries to find his way out of his mind. But understandably, it freaks Rick out pretty bad. During one of these nightmares, Rick gains enough awareness to grab Sleepwalker's Imaginator and rip it away from him. This is where things start to get even more funky. Remember how I said there was another reason why the Sleepwalkers were not allowed to enter human minds? Yeah, that reason is that the two can get entangled, and the Imaginator was not just a navigation device, it also functioned as a shield against that. This is where we finally get to the first thing of many things that makes this character so awesome. Now that he was bound to Rick, this created a very weird psychic dynamic which allowed Sleepwalker to manifest in the real world. In the material plane, all of Sleepwalker's powers functioned just as they normally did, and he was still able to be a capable hero with one very big catch. Sleepwalker could only appear in the physical realm when Rick was asleep. To be clear, I don't mean that Rick turns into Sleepwalker or gains the powers of Sleepwalker. They are 100% independent entities. They're just stuck in this very weird psychic dynamic where whenever Rick is unconscious, Sleepwalker can move around and do stuff. This does mean that there was a period where Rick had absolutely no idea what was going on. He knew that he had some weird dream possession thing happening, and he would see occasional reports of the same green monster from his nightmares running around the city, but the two couldn't exactly communicate with each other, so they couldn't work together much. After a bit though, Sleepwalker was finally able to get enough of an understanding of Rick's mind that he could appear in his dreams at will, and finally explain what on earth had been happening to him for the last several days. Turned out that Rick was actually pretty cool about the whole thing, and the two worked out an arrangement. Sleepwalker still didn't know how to get back home, especially not without the Imaginator, which was still very much lost, but he didn't want to abandon his duty of protecting humans and figured he could just do that from the other side. So from that point forward, New York City had another defender, for approximately 8 hours a day at least, but with the things that Sleepwalker can do, that was more than enough. At this point, we gotta talk about exactly what Sleepwalker's powers are. I've avoided mentioning them up until this point because they are just that unique and awesome. I needed to give them an entire section in this video. First off, Sleepwalker does have what I'll call the kind of standard superhero kit. Increased strength, durability, a slight healing factor, flight, normal stuff. Those aren't the unique ones, but I had to get them out of the way first. Somewhat more interesting is his power as a passive psychic booster. Sleepwalker actually doesn't have a lot of psychic powers himself. He's not much of a telepath or anything like that, but he can amplify the power of his psychic allies. Even though he cannot get back to the mindscape, Sleepwalker is still connected to it fundamentally, and that means he can function as a transmitter for a massive wealth of psychic power. This also takes essentially no effort on his part. Basically, if Sleepwalker is on your team, any psychic powers on your team are just gonna be better by virtue of him only being around. And if you think that's neat, it is absolutely nothing compared to his signature power, Warp Gaze. You know how in dreams, things like space and physics and the forms of objects aren't really consistent? Sleepwalker can weaponize that. Sleepwalker can fully manipulate the structure of physical matter, and in ways that often defy logic. The most iconic example of this is on the cover of his first comic, where he makes a sidewalk itself twist up to grab a robber. The applications of this power are so wide in range that fighting Sleepwalker is basically like fighting the landscape and architecture around you. Anything and everything could be a trap or a weapon. And making things even better, this is technically not a reality warping power, at least not in a magical sense. Warp Gaze actually alters the physical structure of things that it's used on. This is not time-gated or dependent on Sleepwalker's concentration in any way. Once he changes something, it stays changed. Until, of course, something else comes along and changes it, it doesn't lock the things in that position permanently. They can still be broken or have their forms altered in normal ways, which is kind of important considering that Sleepwalker can use this power on air. Oh, did you assume that this only worked on solid objects? Nope, it is any physical matter, and that does include gas. Of course, it's not easy to get gas to stay in a consistent form, even with Sleepwalker's power, but he has been known to use this to create wind currents to speed up his flight, and things like that. Now, the fact that Warp Gaze works on anything might have raised a question for some of you. Does this work on living things? And yeah, it absolutely does. Physical matter is physical matter after all, and if Sleepwalker wanted to go full-on body horror, that is completely within his capabilities. He doesn't though, because Sleepwalker is a good and nice guy and would never do something like this. Never using Warp Gaze on a living thing is like rule number 1 of the Sleepwalker's code, and while Sleepwalker is technically a cop, he is actually committed to the ethics and will not do a police brutality on anyone. So now you might be wondering what the deal is with the images you're looking at, because he's doing a police brutality right there, but don't worry, as is fairly common in Sleepwalker books, this is just a dream sequence created by Nightmare. He is not actually doing that, it's an illusion. And as if these powers aren't cool enough already, we're not even remotely close to done with this section of the video because I haven't touched on how precise Warp Gaze is. Sleepwalker can use his abilities at masterful levels, to such an extent that he once looked at a pile of uncut fabric and was able to turn it into a completed spider suit easily. And this is actually him in a weakened state. Warp Gaze is not designed for the physical realm. It works great there, but it works even better in the mindscape. When Sleepwalker is in his home dimension, he can use Warp Gaze so skillfully that he can perform surgery with it. He can do surgery on people by looking at them. At this point, you might be wondering why Sleepwalker is not like an S-tier Avengers level character. After all, that power is insanely strong, but there's a catch to it, one that is right in the name of the ability, Warp Gaze. Sleepwalker's power is tied directly to his vision. As incredible as the ability is, it is useless outside of his line of sight. I love this. In fact, it is one of my favorite things about Sleepwalker. After all, when you're writing superheroes, giving them cool and strong powers is great, but the limitations to those powers are where you're really going to get interesting things about the character, and this is such an interesting limitation for the power to have. Powers that require physical contact to activate are pretty common, and I like this as a twist on that trope. It means that Sleepwalker's interactions with other superheroes are a lot higher stakes, because yeah, if he gets a lock on you, then you're pretty much screwed, but Warp Gaze doesn't activate immediately. It does take a little bit of time for him to twist things into the right shape. This means that if you're sneaky enough to avoid his gaze, or just fast enough to not stay in his eye line for very long, you actually have the advantage against Sleepwalker. Even if you don't have the physical prowess to manage that, the function of this power means that Sleepwalker can really only target one thing at a time, distract him or pull his attention to something, and he's vulnerable to attack from different angles. Invisibility is not a hard counter to Sleepwalker though, because his eyesight is enhanced in a couple areas. First off, his vision is just really good, like so good that Sleepwalker once identified a specific car he was looking for in the middle of a city from the upper atmosphere. And secondly, he can see energy signatures, both electromagnetic and magical, making it near impossible to find a form of invisibility that he can't detect in some way. All this adds up to make Warp Gaze, I'm just gonna call this here, my favorite superpower of all time. It is such a fantastic combination of really cool and really strong, but not so broken as to be boring. So then what does Sleepwalker do with these powers? The answer is actually quite a bit. He might not be a super well-known character now, but his run in the early 90s was pretty successful. His original series ran for a very solid 33 issues. There wasn't too much overarching storyline in these comics, it was mostly villain of the week type stuff, but Sleepwalker's villains of the week had a reputation in and of themselves. Even though Sleepwalker himself was never really written as a joke character, a lot of his villains definitely were, taking the sort of gimmick villainy you see from Spider-Man rogues and elevating it to new levels of weird. The prime example of this is 8-Ball. 8-Ball has no superpowers, he is a tech-based villain, but all of his gadgets are 8-Ball themed in some way. These can range from relatively normal, at least by comic book standards, like a high-tech pool cue that can strike targets with enhanced force, all the way to absolutely ridiculous, like a flying glider similar to the one that Green Goblin uses, but 8-Ball's is just shaped like a gigantic 8-ball with no further details. Shockingly, this villain out of all of them was not just abandoned in the 90s and is a recurring character in the current Moon Knight comics, not just a recurring one either, a really, really good one of the highlights of the series. Getting back to Sleepwalker though, in between his more out-of-the-box rogues, he was still definitely part of the Marvel Universe at large. His most impressive villain was, of course, Nightmare, which probably doesn't surprise anybody. Of course Nightmare and the Sleepwalkers were not going to be on good terms. And being based in New York City, Sleepwalker had plenty of team-ups with other heroes as well. The first one was Spider-Man, who he did actually fight at first because he mistook him as being an agent of Cobweb. And you know what? Understandable, I guess. Most impressive in terms of team-ups, though, was Sleepwalker's involvement in the original Infinity War. He didn't fight Thanos or anything like that, but he did survive the snap and was part of a small team of heroes, which also included Moon Knight, that protected Earth from some cosmic threats which appeared during that time. Then, only less than a year later, when the Infinity Stones fell into the hands of an evil version of Adam Warlock, Sleepwalker helped again by teaming up with the X-Men and boosting them with his psychic amplification power. All these team-ups took place while the main Sleepwalker series was still going on, and in the pages of his solo book, Sleepwalker was getting closer and closer to a final confrontation with Cobweb. Cobweb's final plan was a big one, taking several of his own minions, disguising them as Sleepwalkers, and then staging basically a false flag invasion of Earth. Sleepwalker turns back the attack with help from the Avengers, but the false flag part is successful and his reputation is otherwise ruined. Cobweb then takes advantage of this chaos to go after Rick. Rick and Sleepwalker had stayed entangled this entire time, and so targeting the much more vulnerable Rick was actually a pretty good plan, but unfortunately for Cobweb, he showed his cards too early. Remember how Sleepwalker had been stuck on Earth in the first place because he lost his Imaginator, which had then mysteriously vanished? Yeah, the reason it had vanished is that Cobweb had noticed it being removed from Sleepwalker and then stolen it while no one was paying attention. It remained secret for a while, but Cobweb's invasion gave it away. After all, Cobweb normally shouldn't have the power to bring a bunch of his own minions to the physical realm, and that tipped Sleepwalker off that he may have the Imaginator somewhere within his body. During their final fight, Sleepwalker's hunch proves correct, and he is able to take the Imaginator back from Cobweb before sacrificing it to exile him. Actually, we don't really know where he went. It's just described as somewhere very far away, and he has not appeared since, so I guess that was true. So Cobweb is finally vanquished, but the Imaginator vanishes with him, meaning that Sleepwalker remains bound to Rick, at least maybe, kind of. Sleepwalker actually kinda dies at the end of issue 33, but it's handled in a very weird way. The last page of not just this issue, but the entire series has a wounded Sleepwalker vanishing into thin air, and then Rick's girlfriend, who at this point knows about the whole thing, kind of just goes, was he dying? It looked like he was dying. And Rick says, it'll probably be fine. I'm sure he can come back from the dead. And then it's over? Then, about a year later, Sleepwalker gets a really minor cameo in a different comic, and when I say minor, I mean exactly 3 panels, and they never address how he came back. That was in 1995, and then there's just nothing for a decade until 2005 when he has a crossover with Black Cat for some reason. In this appearance, he is still bound to Rick, so I guess that never changed, and obviously he's alive, which is once again not explained. So I guess Rick's weird comment in issue 33 about him probably being able to come back was accurate. After this, Sleepwalker would be an uncommon but recurring character for just over another decade. He was never really in the spotlight, but he showed up just enough to prove that Marvel never forgot about him entirely. And then, in 2018, Marvel did maybe one of my favorite things they've ever done, gave Sleepwalker his own comic again. It was a miniseries, and it only ran for 4 issues, but still it counts, and it was really good. This book was a tie-in to the Infinity Wars event. Yes, wars plural, and boy, this is going to be a really weird one to have to explain as a quick sidebar. Basically, Gamora enters the family business, gets a hold of the Infinity Stones, and tries to also eliminate half of all life in the universe because she decided her dad was right. But she doesn't want to kill people, so instead she does this really weird thing where she takes every 2 souls and combines them into 1 soul, which does technically reduce the amount of life in the universe by half by making a weird fused universe. This radically screws up Rick and Sleepwalker's entanglement because Rick gets bound to Nick Fury of all people, and so Sleepwalker goes on his own solo journey to go and fix everything. Really interesting storyline, does a lot of cool work with the Infinity Stones by confirming that there's a pocket dimension inside each of them, and the series revolves around Sleepwalker going through each of these Infinity Stone dimensions one by one. Cool as this comic was, it didn't exactly rocket Sleepwalker back into mainstream popularity, but he does still get his team-ups every now and then. He appeared in 3 issues of Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur, where he teamed up with Moon Girl and Doctor Strange to go fight Nightmare. That is such a weird combination, but man, it was really cool actually. And then he was a main character in 1 arc of the Patsy Walker Hellcat series from 2023. Unfortunately, this is the most recent time that he's been seen though. But that is about to change because of a video game that's going to release soon called Marvel Mystic Mayhem. Now, to be super clear, this video is not sponsored by Mystic Mayhem or anything like that, but I am going to talk about it for a minute because Sleepwalker's in it, and I'm happy. It's a mobile RPG where Nightmare is the main antagonist, so it does make sense that Sleepwalker's in there. I have actually gotten to play the game a little bit in early access, and I'll be honest, I have mixed opinions on Sleepwalker's portrayal. Fair warning, this is going to be me being a little bit pedantic here, but I'm gonna allow myself to be pedantic this one time. His design absolutely rules. I have no complaints about that. I think they did a fantastic job amping up his design from that 90s aesthetic to bring it more in line with modern designs. And some of his attack animations do have him using the Imaginator, which is a detail I appreciate, but on the whole, his attack animations are way too centered around his hands. Like, he doesn't use warp gaze, even though that's his signature thing. Even his ultimate animation has the final attack coming out from his hands. Why is he not using warp gaze? All of his power should be in his eyes. Also, this version of Sleepwalker isn't bound to Rick, at least not in any way that I've seen yet. They're kind of just casting him as a normal Sleepwalker going up against Nightmare, which I guess is fine, but it's still a little bit weird. Anyway, now that I've been pedantic and gotten that out of the way, I am still super happy to see Sleepwalker in this game. Don't get me wrong, like, this is the first time that we've ever seen him in any official media outside of the comics and one action figure, so this gives me unreasonable amounts of joy. I am keeping my fingers crossed that his appearance in Mystic Mayhem is a good sign for Marvel using Sleepwalker more going forward. Will that actually happen? I have no idea, but I will absolutely be running on blind hope for the next couple months. And with that, that is basically everything that I have to tell you about Sleepwalker today, but I will leave you with one final detail, something that the few Sleepwalker fans who have been watching this video have been wanting me to mention the whole time: DOGWALKER. Yes, Sleepwalker has a dog, and the dog's name is DOGWALKER, which is incredibly stupid and also perfect. I would accept absolutely nothing else. This dog was actually made by Sleepwalker, which is a power that I didn't know he had until this arc happened, but yeah, he exists as a psychic construct in the mental plane which Sleepwalker created. Why did Sleepwalker make a psychic dog? Well, it's because he lives among humans now, at least kind of, and he wanted to better understand their nature, and he noticed that humans like dogs, so he figured that he would make his own dog to see what all the fuss was about. And with that, now I have actually said everything that I need to about Sleepwalker. I sincerely hope that I have gotten some of you to care about this character as much as I do. Honestly, if I can get one more person to love Sleepwalker, that's a win, and if I can get a lot more people to love him, then maybe Marvel will notice and make him appear more. As always, thank you so much for watching, and big thank you to Ruben Perez for drawing the avatar that you've been watching talk at you for the last 20 minutes. If you're curious where this avatar is from, check out my tabletop RPG show, The D and Dorks, also on YouTube. This character is from a superhero universe of my own design, which you can find in the season titled Power Play. And with everything finished, I wish I could make a joke about me going to sleep now, but no, I got more videos to edit. Maybe it's a good thing that I don't have my own Sleepwalker bound to me because the world would never see him.